Hi everyone, it's Alex, and today I'm here to review what is probably my most subjective review on this channel. That is for On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous by Ocean Vuong. This is a novel about the story of a character named Little Dog as he's writing a letter to his illiterate mother, mainly talking about his relationship with her, and also in the second half, I would say, of this novel, his relationship, a sexual relationship with a fellow man named Trevor. So much of this book is rooted in navigating sort of the Asian American experience. So immediately, this is a book I was really excited to read because of that, where I share similar qualities. And in fact, so much so in this book, in a very uncanny way, I felt like so many things were so relevant to me that in a way I feel like it's hard for me to review this book fairly. But I would say it is split into these two parts. The first part primarily being about Little Dog and his mother, and the second part being about Little Dog and Trevor. And because of that separation, it does feel quite severed. I do feel like the second part was stronger, where Little Dog gets more specific in his storytelling. Whereas in a way, almost, I feel like the first half that's dedicated to sort of trying to contextualize and explain what it's like to be Asian American, it is familiar and completely, I'm sure, besides myself, especially being a gay Asian American man, there are others that will relate to this, but in a way it feels so encompassing that it doesn't feel specific enough. And I wish it would have tried to be more focused, whether or not dedicating solely the novel either to Little Dog's relationship with Trevor only, or just his relationship with his mother entirely. And with his relationship with his mother, it is quite strained. There is so much frustration. And even thinking of my mom growing up, when you're Asian American, or really even possibly just mixed race in general, and growing up in America, you realize so early on that your life is shaped by your observations of people like your parents that aren't familiar or aren't born in the Americas or United States. So hearing things like talking to people and starting with an apology, immediately I thought of my mom, how she does the same. And even when she begins her apology, talking to strangers in public, if I go grocery shopping with my mom when I was younger, hearing her accent get sharper as a way of signaling just how I'm the other, like it's my fault. That's what it feels like almost. And I feel like that's what Vuong is trying to explain in this book as well. And just ultimately how that builds up to this frustration where, unfortunately, at times, Little Dog is abused by his mother, and just how toxic his relationship with his mother is, but how Vuong, through Little Dog, shows that love is always present and there. It's no secret, I would say, even with the press, with reviews of this book, that On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous is highly autobiographical, even with Little Dog and his mother growing up in Connecticut, and also being Vietnamese American. That's exactly just like how Vuong's life is. And it's so hard to sort of assess this book. I really wish it would have just been memoir. I feel like I could have really liked it more, because I ultimately did find this book quite averaged, or just very mixed. So while Vuong does talk about this concept of othering and frustration and observation, I think ultimately for Little Dog, what the most pivotal moment is realizing that there's a time where his mother does tell him that this man he knew to be his grandfather, she tells him one day, that's not your grandfather, that's not you, that's not your identity. And speaking for myself again, even growing up with my own father, like Little Dog, being estranged to me and not really knowing that American part of my life, apart from my mother, who's from the Philippines, I grew up with grandparents from my stepfather who are white, and just growing up and always being looked at sort of with wonder or spectacle from others, sort of wondering what our relationship is, that always was constantly there for me. I knew it was always something I was aware of, and I knew it very young. So as these experiences accumulate for Little Dog, as he gets older, I think it definitely becomes sort of more of a demonstration of how he perceives relationships as he gets older and meets Trevor, sort of like a foundation for how he sees relationships between men and being a gay man as well. Unfortunately, just like Little Dog and his mother, Little Dog and Trevor have their own sense of miscommunication and frustration. So with Trevor, as it is known that Trevor describes sort of this moment where Little Dog realizes that things aren't going to work because this like prevalent question of masculinity and dominance and power. I feel like with power in Little Dog with his mom, her version of frustration is power because that's what she might think is a way of being American and being successful. It's because frustration is required. But in Trevor's case, his frustration is more about retaining power and retaining being this white American boy and not losing it. With Little Dog, so much of his life, as Vuong writes about him, is so reactionary and so driven by these fleeting moments of feeling. And one of these feelings is a quote I really love about where Little Dog takes action and inaction at the same time. I don't know the quote, I don't have it with me right here, but I'll put it beside me. But it is something like this feeling of why is it that when I reached for him, talking about Trevor, why did it feel like the most me I've ever felt? And I think beyond sexual exploration and realizing your identity, being a part of the LGBTQ community, it is so relevant also that feeling of the difference between being, am I Asian enough or am I American enough? It's that space in between two bodies that feels so much of potential, but also of so much damage. And I really feel that. It's such a familiar feeling for me. And seeing myself in a book like this, I only wish that Vuong would have been more focused about sort of fleshing those moments out, because where we have quotes like that I really enjoy, it seems like everything else gets a bit cluttered or too wordy. I think Vuong really struggles with transitioning between places he wants to get to, where he can have moments like that between Little Dog and Trevor, but then the writing becomes, as they say, maybe quite purple. There was a quote about like this idea of happiness and sadness and what if it was called something else. It felt way too on the nose and almost even condescending. And it goes back to, I feel like, even the sort of idea of explaining Asian American life in the first half of this book almost feels so introductory. Even if I was able to relate to so much to it or to so much of it, I see my life as so ordinary that it makes sense to me. And I had wished that I didn't see myself there because I wanted to not feel like I had to be reminded that so often in my life, I also just anticipate all the time, and I wait to react like Little Dog because of who I am. And I don't know. I can't really explain it. I don't feel like this book. It's not like it's not encompassing of being Asian American. There's so many other books out there that I think do a much better job through storytelling, through the use of a novel. Again, if this had been a memoir, I think it would have been much more successful in that way. But thinking of things like, for example, Severance by Ling Ma, using this apocalyptic background to sort of interrogate where culture comes from and truthfully what it means to be Asian American without all of these sort of things to bounce off of in the periphery. Thinking of other things like Where Reasons End by Yi and Lee, sort of that interrogation of language that Vuong similarly does here in the book. I think in Where Reasons End, it's much more intentional. I think with Vuong, things almost happen as like a happy accident, and even saying that doesn't really describe it appropriately, but that's what it feels like. I'm going to quote a link to this down below, but I think it was an Interview magazine where Vuong, in his interview, he talks about how a lot of the writing for this book was very by impulse or just by feeling, and I think unfortunately that really shows. In some ways, I think that's good where you feel like you're being authentic enough to rely on that. But for the sake of storytelling, I feel like it just doesn't work. And even thinking of using sort of the idea of the letter, I think in a way is a bit lazy. I think it lends itself to abstraction intentionally without really having to explain all of that. And even within all of this sort of flowery, poetic, lyrical prose, which again at times works, I feel like ultimately doesn't, because sometimes we do get these literal explanations that feel so self-satisfying and like a forceful relief. And I know a part of that is because Little Dog is writing this letter to his illiterate mother, so he's trying to like explain himself more, but it felt so not good. And really all of this ultimately to say, it makes me wonder, who is this book for? When I started reading it, I really thought it was for fellow Asian Americans that might be able to relate to this, especially people like myself being a gay Asian American man. And again, there were parts of me I saw in here, but ultimately I felt like, in a way, this was a way to sort of educate people more than tell a story, which is fine. Maybe it's just maybe it's just too familiar for me, and that's why I couldn't really access it the way I wanted to. But the writing itself, the writing style is intimate, without being confessional, which I think is good, without feeling like there's any sense of complete doom or hopelessness, but there's not necessarily like an overarching triumph either. It really feels like it's in the middle. Again, though, I don't know whether or not that was at a sort of luck with Vuong, but I'm glad it wasn't really trying to like sell me something, which is good. And I also know it's not Vuong's job to write for people like me. I know there are plenty of books out there, I'm sure, that are for me in that way, that I just haven't read yet. And I don't expect Vuong to like know every book about gay Asian American men with mom issues or anything. So I think what he's done is something people can really learn from the reading experience. But for me, where it was all too familiar and where I see my life as so ordinary, I just couldn't access it. And I think a part of that is just because of myself, where I belittle my own experiences so constantly, which reminded me as I read this is something I do so unconsciously, something I definitely need to work on. But it's with Little Dog, I'm glad I didn't see him really ever belittle himself either. I think everything was always this moment of clarity in some way, even if that clarity described by Vuong was sometimes a bit purple or just wordy or cluttered or just sometimes even not like good to read. If you've read On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, I'd love to know what you think. This is definitely a book I think that will get a lot more reviews coming in throughout the month. So I'm excited to see what more people say about it. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.